So to follow up with a little bit more about myself, lace has been my primary focus for about 8 years. As lace is such a complex technique, I've always argued that it's important to learn to make lace in order to really understand it, for deep analysis of antique lace and that sort of thing. It's difficult if you haven't studied the techniques yourself, but it's still difficult if you have studied the techniques yourself. So as I was saying a bit earlier, one of the most important things that I've learned in studying lace is that there's always more to learn. And I sometimes feel like the more research I do, the more things I uncover that I hadn't heard about before. But that's what's so exciting about it, because I'll never run out of lace to research or things to travel, places to travel. So let's see. It worked. Okay, good. So to start, I think it's important to define lace, or at least attempt to. What is lace? Is it a particular technique or aesthetic or structure or fiber? Not exactly. Lace, again, as I'm repeating myself, I clearly use this phrase a lot, but it's an umbrella term. And it encompasses myriad techniques and traditions from around the globe, from Nyanduti in Paraguay and var lace in Croatia, to Turkish oya and piña cloth in the Philippines, to bobbin lace traditions in Russia, Malta, Brazil, South Africa, Sri Lanka, and beyond. Part of what makes lace so interesting, in fact, is the difficulty in defining it. The types of lace I just listed are not necessarily structurally related to each other and have different origins, but they all share the attribute of being openwork textiles constructed from multiple threads or thread-like filaments like wire or hair. This is why contemporary techniques such as laser cutting are excluded from this category, even if they can be aesthetically similar to lace. Of course, there's no way I could include all of the global lace traditions in one lecture, and for that reason, I've narrowed the parameters of this talk to the origins of needle and bobbin lace in Western Europe during the Renaissance and their development in fashion. Even that is a massive category, so consider this a basic introduction and by no means exhaustive in including all the lace traditions, even within Western Europe. Why bobbin and needle lace? Well, they're often considered the two most traditional methods of making lace, or at least they were the most predominant in Europe up until the 19th century. Bobbin and needle lace are also aesthetically the closest to machine-made lace we are familiar with today, as they were the inspiration for early lace machines. Finally, the two techniques ran parallel to each other throughout their development, sometimes imitating each other so successfully that they can be very difficult to distinguish without magnification. In fact, in case you haven't read the answer at the bottom here, I'll just let you know that the top left piece here is needle lace and the other three are bobbin lace. So you can see, while there are some aesthetic variations, there are some similarities too. Let's see. So what exactly are bobbin and needle lace? Let's start with needle lace, which is believed to have originated in the last decades of the 15th century. Although, like many historical textiles, the origins are murky, it may have developed in northern Italian convents. That is when we start to see records of it being made, but again, unclear. So the process of making this is eventually started with embroidery on linen, specifically cut work and drawn work embroidery techniques, which you can see in the bottom right corner here. The designs in cut work and drawn work embroidery on linen became increasingly elaborate over time, and as threads were drawn out and cut out and discarded, it became increasingly wasteful. This is a time in the Renaissance when, just in order to produce plain weave linen cloth, you had to grow the flax, you had to ret the linen, you had to process and spin and weave. So to discard any of it for waste material was really a problem. So eventually, the base fabric, the linen fabric, was done away with entirely, and the patterns were worked directly onto parchment by couching outline threads around the pattern design, stitching back into them with buttonhole stitches, stitching back into them with buttonhole stitches without piercing the base in a technique known as punto in aria. And I'll make sure to show you some examples of that later on so you can see what I mean. Then when the lace is finished, you can flip over the parchment and cut away the couching threads to release the lace. And just to be clear, punto in aria, it's a specific type of needle lace, but it means stitches in air. So that's why I like to start with that, because it's, I think it's a good descriptor for what's happening. So in contrast, bobbin lace developed around the same time out of complex braiding techniques. As the multi-strand braids grew increasingly elaborate, the threads were eventually wound onto cylindrical bobbins to keep them clean and organized. To make bobbin lace, a pattern or pricking, as you can see is the rectangular piece of paper here, is pinned to the pillow, and pairs of bobbins are hung on pins and crossed and twisted in patterns to follow the diagram below. So this is a Bush, it's a Flemish bobbin lace that I worked on at Concentrum in Bruges in 2015. And you can see that the threads of the bobbins are interlacing each other. So that's how you're creating lace. Oh, and this is such a treat. This is a wonderful video of a well-known lace maker at Concentrum in Bruges, who's been making bobbin lace for just decades. And I just want to alert you that if you ever watch my own lace videos, don't be disappointed, because I'm about a tenth as fast as she is. All right, oh, for some reason, oh, there we go. Okay, didn't want to let me move to the next slide. All right, so Belgium and Italy both have records from the late 15th century that possibly indicate the origins of bobbin lace. So it's unclear where it originated, but it's possible that it sprung up in two places at once, as happened with weaving traditions around the world. Here you can see a diagram of a hole stitch being made on the upper left, which is one of the first stitches you learn in bobbin lace. And bobbin and needle lace both spread rapidly in the 16th century thanks to the new availability of pattern books such as Le Pomp Opera Nova, which was the first bobbin lace pattern book ever published from Venice circa 1557. You can see that on the right here. We have a copy in the Met, in fact, which is fabulous. And many early bobbin lace edgings like the one on the left, the lower left, can be traced directly to pattern books like Le Pomp, which is pretty exciting to be able to identify that. Alrighty. So, oh, pardon, I jumped ahead of myself. One of the reasons why it's so hard to pinpoint the origins of bobbin and needle lace is that as these techniques developed, they did not have clearly defined categories or names yet. So it's not always clear what early records or inventories are referring to. For example, in English, the word lace can also refer to laces for corsets or shoes because they share a common origin of kind of braiding techniques. And lace can also be lumped in with passymmetry techniques as well. So early records may or may not be referring to lace. It's unclear. When you look at the early laces, which are typically narrow pointed edgings, it is like the one on both sides of the collars here. It's easy to understand the etymology of the word lace in many languages. For example, in Spanish, the word for lace is puntas, or points, and in French, it's dentelle, or little teeth. And in Dutch, it's kant, meaning side or edge. Early laces began as edgings for linen shirts and table linens used in the home, and were immediately adopted as fashion accessories by men and women. I added the image on the right to alert you to a common phenomena among later art dealers, especially during the Victorian era. The lace edging on this garment is likely from the second half of the 16th century, not the extremely early date of 1509. So it was obviously painted on later to make the painting more valuable. Let's see. As lace makers and designers innovated new techniques, bobbin lace edgings began to explode forth from collars in an early version of the ruff, as you can see here on the left. Needle lace during this period is not entirely freed from a base fabric, and you often see cutwork embroidery and buttonhole stitches used together in a style called reticella, seen here. Although punto nadia needle lace had freed makers from the perpendicular threads of the warp and weft, many designers still created fashionable geometric patterns for their lace designs. But in the scalloped edge here, you see the beginnings of curvilinear lace designs. There are also examples of figural laces from this period, which are relatively rare, but were sought after by later collectors, and are thus well represented in museum collections. This detail is one frame of a 5-foot length of punto and adia, illustrating the story of Judith and Holofernes, which is perhaps my favorite piece of lace ever made. It's actually 13 panels, so it really illustrates the whole story in detail, like a comic strip, and then it has Portuguese inscription across the top. It's unclear what this would have been used for, but it was likely displayed in the home rather than worn, or perhaps had an ecclesiastical use. By the late 16th century, we have already gone from narrow edgings to enormous millstone ruffs, like this one worn by Elizabeth I in 1585, which looks to be possibly reticella edged with bobbin lace. Just guessing. But to be clear, the lace worn by Queen Elizabeth was singularly spectacular during this period, and she made sure of it by passing some of the first sumptuary laws against the wearing of lace. These laws limited the use of gold or silk laces and regulated precisely how large your lace collars or cuffs could be. And in some instances, you hear of ostentatious offenders wearing ruffs larger than their station, having them chopped down in public, which is obviously horrifying to me as a lace maker. However, as with most sumptuary laws, these regulations didn't stick. And the 17th century became perhaps the most elaborate period for lace accessories in history. It's no surprise that the extravagant ruffs adopted by fashionable men and women were subject to both admiration and criticism. One critic described them as the cartwheels of the devil's chariot. And they were also caricatured in images like this one on the right, depicting a special ruff laundress's shop. Ruffs are actually constructed of a long strip of lace attached to a linen band and then ironed or goffered into a figure-8 pattern and starched. They had to be frequently laundered and reshaped, which allowed the wearer to show off different areas of the lace design. Of course, starch alone wasn't enough to support a heavy lace ruff, so they were also held up using wire supportas, such as this one, belonging to the Flemish painter Rubens. And I'll just say that many of these photos I actually took on my own travels back in 2015, this one included. Of course, another way to set yourself apart was to have your lace starched or dyed with different color pigments like pink or blue, but none were more fashionable in the early 17th century than yellow. And I have a sort of infamous story of the backlash of against fashion and crime in this time period. So one well-known story highlighting the backlash against fashionable lace accessories is that of Anne Turner of England, who was known for her skill in starching lace ruffs using a costly pigment made of saffron. Anne was also a lady in waiting to Frances Howard, an English noblewoman and wife of the Earl of Essex, who had fallen in love with Robert Carr, a favorite of the king. In order to divorce her husband, the Earl, and marry her lover, Robert, Frances wanted to get rid of the moral poet Sir Thomas Overbury, who was trying to bar their union. So she asked Anne Turner, who due to her dye business was well connected with apothecaries who could provide all manner of substances. She asked her to get her some poison, and with it they poisoned Overbury in 1613 in a poisoned tart. However, their scheme was discovered and Anne was tried for murder. The judge was so repulsed by Anne and her yellow lace, which represented the extravagance of fashion, that he sentenced her to wear yellow lace to the gallows, to forever taint it and force it out of fashion. And it quickly disappears from portraiture after this time. By 1620, millstone ruffs had also gone out of fashion and were replaced with half-moon shaped collars such as standing bands and rabato. Rabato were lace collars built directly on the wire understructure, like the one you see here on the right, edged with lace, and how fabulous. Whereas standing bands were made of linen and held up with starch and a separate supportas underneath. This exquisite standing band incorporates cutwork emabryory, reticella lace, and a punto and adia border, and many had elaborate tassels like these as well. Venice was known for tassel making as well as lace making. In the second quarter of the 17th century, the stiff upright collars have begun to look outdated, and a new, softer fashion for unstarched falling band collars come into vogue. These are often called Van Dyck collars after the Dutch painter Anthony van Dyck that you see here, who often depicted them worn by his sitters. So although it's not clear whether the lace changed to keep up with the fashion or if the fashion changed to keep up with the lace, this shift from stiff collars to softer ethereal ones also reflected new developments in bobbin lace design. Here you can see an example of typical Flemish bobbin lace from this time period, the early 17th century, which had filled out from earlier densely braided lace scallops. Flanders was known for their gossamer fine linen threads, which could be spun by hand 10 times finer than a modern machine can for linen threads, which is incredible, and led to their reputation as the finest source for bobbin lace in all of Europe. Simultaneously, developments in needle lace were enhancing its technical strengths as well. During the Baroque period, Venice became known for a padded three-dimensional style of needle lace known as gros point or gros point de Venise, which was often produced in convents or orphan schools. At its peak, historian Pat Earnshaw estimates that Venetian gros point lace could contain as many as 6,000 buttonhole stitches per square inch. And keep in mind that all of this was done in probably poor lighting, at least no electric lighting, and just by eye. So pretty incredible. You often hear these myths of, you know, lace makers going blind by 30, and I think that that's probably hyperbole, but I do understand how, as a 33-year-old, if you start to need glasses and you can't afford them, you might need to look for a new occupation. So the lace you see on the right is believed to be from the neighboring lace community of Venice in Croatia, Ragusa, and incorporates three-dimensional aspects of Venetian gros point with figures executed in Croatia Ragusa style filling. So it's this sort of more fillet crochet looking aesthetic. And this is a fabulous little collar. Here you can see a piece of gros point. Oh, nope. Sorry, I switched my own notes around. So, gros point needle lace became so popular with the court of Louis XIV that the government once again stepped in during the 1630s and 40s to ban the wearing of lace in France entirely. So not just importing, but wearing it at all. However, there were already several small lace making communities in France, such as in Le Puy-en-Velay on the East Coast, where I've studied. And the makers were severely impacted and became destitute. Seeing this, the Jesuit priest Saint-Régis went to Toulouse and argued that the government should reverse the law to save French lace makers. And shockingly, they agreed. Having failed to ban lace, the French cultural minister under Louis XIV, Colbert, realized that if you can't beat them, join them. And in the 1660s, he began to pilfer lace makers and designers from Venice to come to France and establish royal lace making centers in Alençon and Argentan. This was no small feat, as lace knowledge was a fiercely protected state secret in Venice at the time, and the punishment for sharing it could be imprisonment or death. So here you can see a piece of gros point lace in progress, where you can see the process I described earlier. There are the parchment pattern is tacked down on a piece of fabric. There are couched outline threads that are beginning to appear on the right side. And then on the very far right, you see the motifs are starting to be filled in with buttonhole stitches that aren't piercing the base. So this is how, when you turn it over, then you're able to remove the lace. So, unfortunately for Venice, who tried to defend themselves from the French state stealing their lace knowledge, the French succeeded in their scheme and established a royal needle lace manufactory producing replicas of gros point needle lace that was called Point de Colbert after the cultural minister. Perhaps you've noticed that multiple names of Italian and other laces are in fact French, even if the lace itself doesn't originate there, such as Gros Point de Venise. And that is a testament to the success of the French in impacting the lace industry. By 1680, the heavy Baroque gros point style lace began to fall out of fashion, and with it began the decline already of the Venetian lace industry, which never fully recovered, although they did have a revival in Burano Island in the late 19th century. Supposedly, a lady of the court of Louis XIV, Madame de la Fontange, innovated this new style of towering lace headdresses that you see on the left in an attempt to gain the king's attention. Unfortunately, she did not succeed in catching his eye, but she did launch a new fashion that necessitated a much finer type of lace to drape and ruffle atop the head. Around this time, French lace designers also innovated their own new style of needle lace called point de France, typified by the tiny scale and elaborate figurative motifs without the raised edges typical of Venice. And you can see that in the cravat on the right. Here is a close-up detail of one of the figures in the point de France cravat from the last slide. And for reference, this figure is only about 1.5 inches high, so it's really incredibly fine work. In an attempt to keep up with fashion, Venetian needle lace had also begun to shrink down its motifs to the much finer three-dimensional needle laces known as rose point and point de neige, or snowflake point. And I just want to pause and point out that this particular piece from the collection of Tessie Schoenholzer-Nichols was taken when I was doing my first ever lace identification course during my travels in 2015 at the Fondazione Liscio in Florence. Tessie is actually now at the St. Gallen Lace Museum in Switzerland, but she had been previously in Florence for 30 years. And I remember entering this class with her. It was a week-long class, and I remember entering and thinking, I know something about needle and bobbin lace. I can tell them apart, at least basically. And after this whirlwind, crazy few days with her, I left the classroom, even at the end of the first day, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm just a grain of sand in the whole world, in the whole ocean of lace, and I could never possibly learn all of this. But fortunately, my confidence has grown, and now I feel like I'm maybe a handful of sand. I'm working on it. Anyway, moving on. So in more developments in bobbin lace, we've seen figural needle laces like the Judith and Holofernes, punto and aria lace, but we haven't seen much figural bobbin lace yet. Although there were some patterns with little figures as early as the Lepant pattern book in 1557, they were quite rudimentary. It's much easier to create complex designs in needle lace, not easier to execute, but easier to design, perhaps, because you are using one needle and one thread at a time. So you can start your stitches anywhere on the pattern. But in bobbin lace, you have to diagram out where the bobbins will travel and connect in your pattern. You can't just design arbitrarily, or you'll have a hard time working the pattern. There are contemporary lace makers who do this. They just draw and they throw bobbins down and work, but it's just more challenging, especially if you're trying to execute a pattern this complicated. So this apron border from the 17th century reveals how much further bobbin lace design had come in working complex patterns. Also important to note is this is around the time that you would start to see mesh background in lace that is separate from the motifs, which would have been worked after the completion of the figures. That's why it's sort of smushed in certain places and it doesn't look like it's perfectly worked up and down. Not that it isn't absolutely gorgeous and stunning and better than I could do. Also, I want to say I love how these figures are themselves wearing fashionable lace accessories with the fontange headdress on the woman and the lace cuffs on the man. All right, so I'm going to guess that most of you watching this lecture are huge fans of 18th century fashion, as I am. I admit that lately I'm more and more drawn to the 17th century, but I still love the confectionery frills of the 18th century. And indeed, the 18th century was a fantastic time for lace until it wasn't. This portrait of Maria Theresa of Austria, mother of Marie Antoinette, might represent the pinnacle of bobbin lace making in fashion in the form of this incredible Brussels lace covered gown. According to the Museum of Fashion and Lace in Brussels, the lace for this gown cost the modern day equivalent of $750,000 and took hundreds of lace makers working together 7 months to produce. You can see that the needle lace on the right here is imitating the mesh ground aesthetic of the Brussels lace as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about Brussels lace and what that means in just a moment. These laces you can see here are all Flemish bobbin laces typical of the 18th century, but I want to point out a distinction between the two pieces of Malines or Mechlin lace on the top and the two pieces of Brussels lace on the bottom. Brussels lace, which can also be known as point d'Angleterre, a term that I'll come back to, is a general name for part laces made in Belgium during this time, meaning bobbin lace worked in separate parts that were then assembled and grounded together, usually by a master lace maker. This is what allowed so many lace makers to work together on Maria Theresa's gown. In contrast, the Malines or Mechlin lace on the top, which are the French and Flemish names for the same style of lace, respectively, are an example of continuous bobbin lace, meaning they are worked with one set of bobbins in a long continuous strip. But in no way does that make them less complicated or time-consuming to produce. In fact, a 10-centimeter wide strip of Mechlin or Valenciennes in this period used up to 800 bobbins, and a single pair of cuffs worked in this style could take 10 months for one lace maker to produce, working 15-hour days with only Sunday off. And this is a statistic that comes from Santino Levy's book, Lace a History, which actually has this wonderful portrait of Maria Theresa on the cover. Here's another incredible example of a Brussels lace or point d'Angleterre lace cravat, where you can see how clearly the motifs are worked individually, and then the background mesh is set in after. That's why the background mesh curves around the shapes rather than running straight up and down. If you're wondering why Brussels lace is also called point d'Angleterre, or that they are similar laces, it is honestly still a mystery to lace historians, like many things. For many historians, our job is never done. Most likely, it was a Flemish lace that was exported to England and was named for where it was popular rather than where it was made. Let's see. Oh, I have no idea why it's doing this. I don't even know how to do these effects, but enjoy. All right. For lovers of 18th century silk, I also want to mention that silk designs and lace designs were very influential to one another during this period. You may be familiar with the so-called bizarre silks of the early 1700s with unusual abstracted designs, like the one on the bottom left here. And on the upper left, you can see a piece of bobbin lace clearly influenced by bizarre silk designs. This is also from the collection of Tessie Schoenholzer-Nichols. And then following this, there was a fashion in silk designs for dentelle or lace patterns with woven borders of lace winding through them, which you can see in the example on the right. This particular piece is more, the motifs are more inspired by lace than actually having strips of lace represented in it, but you will find that both of those in lace patterns and silk patterns from this time. So in the second half of the 18th century, fashion in the courts of Western Europe began to move away from the decadent Rococo aesthetic to a more supposedly naturalistic style. Lace is still popular with men and women during this time period, but the designs of lace slowly became more sparing, and the mesh ground began to take up more and more dominance over the motifs. Here are some examples of that in these late 18th century Valenciennes bobbin laces. As I mentioned before, Valenciennes was a continuous bobbin lace, which started out as an incredibly complex and densely patterned lace used for lappets and that sort of thing. But at this point, it has shifted to a much more mesh-based lace with little dots and floral sprigs. And I can attest that this is still very complicated to work, having taken Valenciennes classes myself. And although the town of Valenciennes is now a part of France, lace-making developed there while it was still a part of Flanders, but under Spanish control. Lace-making was the main export of Flanders at the time and a very costly one, and the French fought the Spanish very hard to gain control of the city. So now when you look at the border of Belgium and France, the town of Valenciennes looks like a little bite out of Flanders. Obviously, I've simplified very complicated history of Flanders and the whole region that is now Belgium, but it's far too much to get into here. And as much as I've studied it, it's a lot to wrap your head around. So apologies if I've flattened that. All right, the 19th century. So I used to begin this section by saying that the French Revolution and the invention of lace machines spelled the death of the lace industry, but I'm feeling more optimistic these days, and I would really like to say that it really just, it changed and dispersed. The French Revolution did abruptly halt the lace industry in France for about 30 years until it was revived under Napoleon I. And there's some fabulous empire-style laces with bees that Empress Josephine commissioned and that sort of thing. We have some in the mat. And tastes for elaborate, ostentatious lace fell all across Western Europe, given the association with the old regime, unfortunately. So lace makers were definitely struggling. And then in 1808, the first true lace making machine was invented, the bobbinette machine, which could make tulle onto which handmade motifs could be applied. This was followed by the Lever's lace machine, which used jacquard technology. That's what you see here, and quickly advanced to making figural lace design by the 1830s, which definitely put many hand lace makers out of business. And these machines were subject to the Luddite rebellions that you've probably heard about in regards to weaving jacquard looms. So here's an example of a Lever's lace machine in Calais, France, which used to be a major manufactory of lace, but is now a museum. In fact, machine-made lace manufactories have struggled in recent decades just as much as the handmade lace industry did a century or two ago. And this prompted Chanel to buy their own machine lace manufacturer, Sophie Hallette, to protect them from closure. Machine lace made with jacquard technology is substantially more expensive and elaborate than most of the machine-made lace you see today, which is basically produced on knitting machines. Here are some examples of exquisitely patterned silk or blonde laces made in the Calais manufactory. And this you may recognize as a really wonderful piece of Lever's lace that was made to showcase technology at the turn of the century for the Paris Expo of 1900. It includes steam engines, electricity, hot air balloons, and the lace itself would have been considered cutting edge technology at that time, believe it or not. It's like the iPhone of 1900. We're lucky to have a piece of this in black silk at the Ratti Textile Center. By the 1860s, a Swiss firm developed the Schiffli machine to produce lace and embroidery, which is still widely used today. To make lace, the machine would embroider a design onto a substrate that would later be dissolved in chemicals in a process known as chemical lace or Schiffli lace. Here's an example of Schiffli or chemical lace, and you can see that it is attempting to imitate the three-dimensional aesthetic of Gros Point needle lace. Just to clarify, the machines, the jacquard machines, the Levers and bobbinette machines that I mentioned before, those were imitating bobbin lace, and the Schiffli is imitating needle lace. So there was a differentiation between those, even in manufacturing by machine. And there are many other lace machines, such as the Barman machine and the Rochel machine, that I won't get into, but many of them are sadly now obsolete. Although I think there's still a lace manufactory in New Jersey and one in Rhode Island, believe it or not. Despite all of this strife and technological advancement, lace makers innovated new ways to persevere and stay relevant in fashion. Tatting is a lace making method that emerged in the early 19th century as a way to create lace more quickly by making knotted rings. And please note that quickly is relative. It's still very time consuming. You will often see shuttles like this one on the left in 18th century portraits, but they were not used for tatting. They were used to make a different kind of knotted edging that was a popular pastime among the aristocracy. Tatting can also be done using a needle. Crochet lace is another technique that emerged in the early 19th century and was specifically developed to imitate needle lace, but using a long hook rather than a needle. In fact, 17th century needle lace accessories like this purse are often confused for crochet because they look so similar to our modern eyes. But although there were relatives of crochet lace in earlier centuries, such as tambour embroidery, which is a chain stitch embroidery technique worked with a hook that developed in northern India, crochet as we know it today didn't exist until the early 19th century. Although crochet lace spread to many regions that I'm now learning about, Hungary, France, and Orvieto, Italy, it is most strongly associated with Ireland. This is because the development of crochet lace coincided with the famine in Ireland, and the crochet lace industry was established there by the English to give the impoverished Irish women an income. Irish crochet became hugely popular and was supported by Queen Victoria. This story is not an anomaly, and in fact, it is one of hundreds of examples of philanthropic efforts to establish lace-making in impoverished communities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And unfortunately, I don't have time to get into many of these, but I'm hoping to make this the subject of a future talk. In fact, I'll be talking about one settlement house that set up lace-making in Boston for the TSA conference this fall, if anyone's attending virtually. So I'd also like to add that Ireland is home to a huge variety of lace beyond crochet, which is something that I learned about from my friend and Irish lace maker and scholar Fiona Harrington. So please look her up and the Headford Lace Project if you want to learn more about lace in Ireland. Another example of a type of lace that emerged in the 19th century is Battenberg or tape lace, which is made using pre-made woven tape stitched together with buttonhole stitches. This type of lace actually has its roots back in the Renaissance in a type of lace known as mezzopunto. Tape laces can also be applied to machine-made tulle to create lace designs, which is called princess lace. Tape laces are still produced by hand in China in the form of the umbrella you see on the left, but also much finer lace products. But even these industries, which are now over almost 2 centuries old, are beginning to close down for lack of demand. Bobbin and needle lace also continued to innovate new styles to compete with the changing fashion marketplace. Chantilly lace of Big Bopper fame, Gen Z doesn't usually get that reference, but maybe you guys will, I don't know. Is a black silk bobbin lace made in and around the town of Chantilly in northern France. Although lace has been made in these communities already for centuries, the Chantilly style, which is defined by an ornate Victorian floral motifs outlined in a thicker gimp thread, didn't emerge until about the 1830s. It quickly became all the rage in the form of huge shawls and lappets like these, and it was closely imitated by weavers' lace machines. In fact, Chantilly machine-made lace is some of the finest ever produced, and it is really incredibly difficult to tell apart from handmade. So you really need magnification to tell them sometimes. Spanish blonde or silk lace was another style of bobbin lace that became popular during this time. Although it's associated with black lace mantilla, Spanish blonde was also made using undyed silk like you see here. What sets Spanish blonde apart from French blonde lace is the use of a heavy silk floss to fill the motifs, which give them an opaque appearance against the sheer tulle ground. At the same time, in Belgium, point de gaze lace came to epitomize the Victorian aesthetic of needle lace. As with the tulle ground in bobbin lace, the ground used in point de gaze has fewer twists, so it's less dense and more airy and lightweight, and also a little bit quicker to produce, although quicker, again, is very much relative. As with all the laces I have mentioned in this lecture today, there are still practitioners and enthusiasts of traditional laces, including point de gaze, bobbin lace, all the types I've described, all around the world, but very, very few who sell what they produce, mostly hobbyists and enthusiasts. Handmade lace is not a profitable industry on a large scale, and in fact, it never really was for lace makers, who only saw a fraction of the money that was paid for the laces they made. It was the merchants who made all the money. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't still designers today incorporating handmade lace into their designs. And I'm gonna jump quite a bit ahead into the future, skipping the entire 20th century, apologies. We'll get back to that another time. But I couldn't give a lecture on lace and fashion without giving a shout out to a couple members of Brooklyn Lace Guild who are doing just that, incorporating lace into their designs in innovative and sustainable ways. First, on the left, is Kasuni Rathnasuriya of the label Kerr New York, which is produced in her native Sri Lanka using locally made Bir Lau bobbin lace. Her designs are beautiful, modern, and feminine, and sustainably produced all within 3 miles of her home, or her former home. Now she lives in New York. So please go check her out. And then on the right is Cara Quinteros, who graduated from Parsons this year with her BFA in fashion design. Congratulations to Cara. Believe it or not, Cara learned to make bobbin lace only about 18 months ago, or maybe 2 years ago, and has quickly become an incredibly skilled lace maker and designer. Her thesis collection was completely zero waste, using locally made yarns to create handmade bobbin lace designs with upcycled hardware. She also named each garment after individuals that inspired her and supported her, and I'm honored that she named this the Elena top after me. These are just two of the many incredibly skilled designers and makers of Brooklyn Lace Guild that I'm proud to know. Every one of our talented members and friends in the entire global lace community give me hope for a future where fashion is sustainable, accessible, and not reliant on the underpaid, backbreaking labor of lace makers in the past or of global garment workers in sweatshops today. So let's look to them for inspiration. Thank you so much. See if I can escape this and come back to have questions. All right. Oh, wow, 5:45 on the dot. That's pretty impressive.
Great work. Thank you so much, Elena. So with that said, does anyone have any questions? We've got plenty of time. If you do, feel free to type it into the chat, or you can try waving at me if you don't feel like typing is going to work out for you.
Well, I hope you can hear me. I have a question. Which
Yes.
went faster? Like, I'm fanatic about crochet because it's faster than knitting. So which went faster, bobbin or needle?
You know, I think bobbin lace can be faster, but that is, again, it's relative because it's really dependent on the designs. For example, in one of the first slides, let's see if I can get back to it. Well, you'll have to trust me on this because I don't want to lose the screen again. But my teacher in Vicenza in Italy, who taught me Burano needle lace, she was working on this piece that was about, you know, just a regular table mat kind of size. And that was, it took her 3 months and she worked on that all day. That was all she really did as a demonstrator in the local museum. So it's very slow. Like I said, though, bobbin lace can be slow as well. So it really depends. But I do feel like there's kind of the same way that there's a divide in the crochet and knitting world. I'm a crocheter and I don't knit. And I know that that's definitely a thing. In the lace world, it's similar. That many people just do needle or bobbin lace. I've worked very hard to get into needle lace, to get better at it. But I find it's one of those things where whatever you're used to becomes more comfortable for you. So it's harder for me to do needle lace. So maybe that's why it's slower for me, but.
Great. So Elena, we have a question.
Okay.
How do you go about creating a local lace guild, or do you know of any existing lace guilds in Texas?
Actually, I'm certain that there are some lace guilds in Texas. To talk a little bit about the origins of the Brooklyn Lace Guild, it was part of my project when I traveled to Europe for 4 months that I proposed that I would go study lace making and then come back and form my own guild. So that was the scariest part for me because I didn't know if anyone was going to show up to the meeting. So basically I just emailed a bunch of people and invited them to come join, and the rest is history. And it's been amazing that that really worked out. But fortunately, although New York City unbelievably didn't have its own guild, there are many guilds across the US. And there's an umbrella organization, IOLI, or the International Organization of Lace, Inc. And that is their website address. It's internationalorganizationoflace.org. That has guilds all over the place. So they definitely have guilds in Texas. And if they don't have one close to you, they probably know a lace maker close to you. It's a pretty tight-knit community. So when you find one lace maker, you can sort of find the rest. It's nice like that. And also, just to give a shout out to IOLI, they're having their convention online next month. So I think they actually have beginner classes, and there are other lectures that are happening next month if you're interested in learning more.
And we'll get that information, and we'll post it on our event page for this so that everyone has access to that as well. Another question about the non-Western lace making. Could you recommend books or resources on that subject of non-Western lace?
Yeah, that's something I was really working on when I was putting this lecture together. I would like to include more of those things into like resources generally. The problem is that the lace community, it's not a topic that's been written about extensively. There are a few kind of go-to books that people rely on, like Santina Levy's Lace: A History. But as far as international lace communities, often they're books that are just on that particular region, and they may be in the language of the region. That's not to say that you can't find information about them, but there isn't like one book I can point you to that talks about global lace traditions. There should be. But please feel free to reach out to me. I know my email was only up for a second, but I'm going to put it in the chat here, and I can connect you to people who know much better than me. In fact, I was having a conversation with people today in a chat group, a lace chat group, about Nyanduti in Paraguay, and a number of people wrote to me immediately and said, "Oh, I studied there. I know somebody there. I know this person." So, again, we can connect you to different places.
Great. Thanks for that. And also, if you ever have any trouble, feel free to email Fashion Studies, and we will also connect you to Elena as well. So another question here about being interested in the fashion industry, especially with textiles and history. What sort of things do you need to study or go to college for to get into this? Which I think is a great question, because it's one of the reasons why we wanted to do this series, is how do people get here?
Yeah, it's even a conversation that we're having internally within the museum where I work, is how do we get more people? How do we open the doors for people to break into this field? Because it can be not only intimidating, but it can be a hard field to break into. But don't let that stop you, because there's so much out there to research and study, and you have lots to contribute. I came into this field from a maker's background. So my background is, I was a weaver and a crocheter and an embroiderer, and I made clothing, and I worked in fashion for like a decade before I actually went back to school and did the master's degree in fashion history at NYU, or costume history, as they say. My advice to you would be, if you're at a level where you're wanting to go into graduate studies, look at the FIT program. They're really fantastic and affordable, and there's so many wonderful people that teach there. That's a really great one. Read everything that you can. In fact, oh dear, now I'm gonna forget the title. No, I think it's called Fashion History: A Global View, is a book that I just read that just came out this year. That's really, really fantastic. That gives not only a great introduction to the whole field of fashion history, it has a bibliography of like all the different, everyone, Anne Hollander and all these Boucher and these people in the 20th century that started writing about fashion history. But then it breaks down the sort of like Western leaningness of fashion studies and how that's problematic, and it goes into a more global perspective. So it's a book I just can't recommend enough. I'm going to type it into the chat for you. So I think read what you can, and know that everyone gets into this field differently. So people come from maker's background, people come from English major backgrounds, people come from tech. There's no wrong way to break into this field. You just have to be passionate about it. And
find community members in your area.
Find community members.
That.
Yeah, I guess I shouldn't recommend FIT and just assume that you're in New York, because this is an online lecture. My apologies. But there are programs popping up all over the place. There's a fantastic program in Wisconsin at the University of Madison that I went to recently. It's under their home ec department, and they have like fabulous fashion historians there. So it's something that you can find all over the place. It just might not be called fashion history, but there are people that are doing this all over the place. So it's great.
Thank you for that, Elena. I think there are definitely a number of professional organizations like the Textile Society of America and the Costume Society of America that probably can provide great regional resources as well. We have another question about the relationship between lace making and making braids with human hair, as you're demonstrating.
Oh yeah, I love this. That's a great question for me. We actually have, so Victorian hair making or hair work traditions don't necessarily overlap exactly with lace traditions, but there is a tradition of making lace with human hair. Some of the oldest known pieces are in the V&A. They have a few really amazing pieces. One of them I think is on view permanently in a drawer in their English galleries. And at the time, it's a 16th century needle lace made with brown hair. It's much easier to do needle lace because you just have one needle and one strand of hair. And this was really a novelty thing. So people just wanted something weird and cool, I think. And then in Ratti, we have a Chantilly bobbin lace human hair fan. And that is just mind-bogglingly incredible. But technically there is an overlap actually with the table work in Victorian like hair art, which is also overlaps with the Japanese braiding technique kumihimo, where they use this little table and there's a hole in the center and you hang hairs around it on little bobbins and you kind of cross and twist them and you make these kind of braided beads. You might see Victorian hair jewelry that's like braided beads, and that is related to bobbin lace braiding, absolutely. But then there are other bobbin lace hair work techniques that aren't related, like, oh dear, I've taken classes in this and I'm blanking, but there's like wire work and things like that that are a little different, but there is an overlap.
And another question, you mentioned larger bobbin lace patterns, like those with the figurines inside, needing a pattern to create the lace. How are those patterns created? And are there examples of pin patterns out there?
So that is such a great question. And it's something that my colleague Devin Tyne and I, and Gunnel Teitel, who are volunteers in the Ratti with me, that we have a wonderful time working on the lace collection together, that we talk about all the time. How did they come up, how did they figure this out? So the designer would draw an illustration, but then the lace makers would actually have to figure out how to work that. So really the work that the lace maker was doing, not just in the time of physical labor, but in having the capacity to figure out the design in their head and how they could work it, was far more labor and more complicated than just drawing the illustration. It really is mind-boggling, some of these pieces. Starting in about the 1920s, I think is the date I've seen for it, Belgian lace schools started to color code diagrams the way that you might see in knitting and crochet books and that sort of thing, where you can look at a diagram of something while you're working it and follow it along, and the different colors will tell you what stitches to use in different areas. But that kind of diagramming is super labor intensive, and for really complicated large scale patterns, they wouldn't really have been able to do that. It would have been as much work to do that in advance of making the lace as just making the lace in the first place. So what we think is that they just had an incredible amount of knowledge in their head, and they just knew what they were doing and figured it out as they went along. But you can today certainly buy patterns that have all the information you need to make them, and you don't have to know how to do it first. So that's good.
I think that might be all of the questions. We are recording this, and
oh great,
we'll edit and work on posting and sharing this with the community at some point soon, hopefully before the end of next month. But if there's no other questions, just want to say again, thank you to everyone who joined us for this, for all of the wonderful resources that you've shared on here, which I'll compile and put together with the event page here so that those don't get lost. And Elena, thank you so much for all of this. It's amazing. The research, the like making and the labor side of all of this really, I think, is such a fascinating history that deserves as much attention as we can kind of draw out of it. So with that said, I hope you all have a lovely remainder of your evening, and I hope to see you again at some other future event. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming.